Last year I tested my soil for the very first time and I learned a lot of fascinating things. This time I want to compare whether I was able to fix some of the problems that I learned from last year, and also I want to test some new areas that I've been having troubles with and satisfy my curiosity by testing whether my raised bed soil is actually good enough to grow plants throughout the year. The first bed we are testing today is this one right here. When you test a single area or bed, you're not just taking one soil sample. So the first thing I'm going to do is come down here at the end of the bed. I'm going to move this mulch aside, and then we're not going to be sampling from the surface. We're trying to sample where the actual plants are growing, where the roots are, and that is 2 to 6 inches beneath the soil surface. So this trowel has a handy depth gauge. So I'm gonna go to 2 inches there, scoop off that, move that aside, and then I'm going to take a nice little chunk out from this area that's about 4 to 6 inches deep. So that's what we're looking for right there. I'm gonna set it in here, move on to the next site. So this is a bed that I tested last year, and one of the things that it showed up as is having very low soil organic matter. Now, soil organic matter is not something that every test will show you, so that's why I like this test in particular. And soil organic matter is kind of like the health check for your garden, especially if you're an organic or low-till gardener. It's probably the most crucial piece of information. It's essentially how much, well, it is actually how much organic matter is in your soil at depth. And organic matter is what's feeding all the soil organisms, all the soil life, that in turn you're hoping will be feeding your actual plants. So that's why it's such a critical thing for me to understand. I want to make sure that I'm increasing that number every single year, up to a certain extent, of course, but the general goal is to always have that number increase so that I could get higher organic matter in my soil. Now, this test does cover all sorts of other things, like all the major and minor elements that most plants need, also your pH, and pH was another thing that was really interesting. Some of my garden was a little bit off on the pH balance, so I'm curious to see if it's changed this year. Now, to be clear, I didn't actually try to address that very much. I didn't really do anything to add or reduce the pH level, but we did have a lot more rain this year. I'm hoping that maybe some of that rain recharged the soil, washed away some of that. I don't know if that really affects pH or not. I'm just entirely guessing there, but I'm just nevertheless curious to see how that number has changed over time. Now we have 3 different parts of this bed, and what we're going to do is blend this all together, and that's going to be our sample. So the goal here is to blend all those samples together, break it up a bit, and if you find any like woody material like this little stick here, you don't want to put that in your test. You don't want to put any rocks, worms, or anything like that. You just want really nice, fine soil. So that's going to be basically what the sample looks like. Let's go ahead and throw this in the sample bag. As I mentioned, you do want to pull out that chunky material, and if your soil is really quite chunky and full of rocks and sticks and all sorts of things, then you could definitely sift it. This is just a 1/4 inch hardware cloth sifter that I built using some scrap 2x4s. So you could just do something like that. And now you have all that big stuff separated. These are actually just soil balls, but if you did have a lot of rocks and sticks, that would be a great way to deal with it. So now what we're left with is nice clean soil. And by the way, guys, this is our very own Epic Gardening sample kit. This is the same kit I did last time, but now we've partnered with them and you're gonna get the same results, but now you're getting it through us, which is really quite fun. So all you do is you take your bag, it comes with a little instruction card, and you just fill the bag to that little green fill line. So all I'm gonna do is grab this. It's not gonna be all the soil I collected here, that's for sure. Fill it up, just like that. Then I'm gonna seal it. And make sure that if you buy multiple kits that your bag actually does match what it says on the box and that you didn't like mix it up somehow. Go ahead, throw it in. Comes with a pre-packaged little sticky thing here, and it already has a shipping label on the back, which can actually go into any mail carrier, USPS, or dropped at the postal office. And the cool thing about this test is that it's very fast. So as soon as they get this, they will get your results back to you within just a few days, which is something I definitely appreciate because some other soil labs can get backed up. You're gonna be waiting way too long to be able to take action. So that is basically how you collect the soil test. I'm going to show you how to register this, but first I want to talk about the rest of the plan for what I'm testing and what I'm actually looking for from these tests. The sites that we're going to be testing on this side of the garden is the no-dig bed again. This is one I tested last year. Very curious to see if it's changed. I have treated it the same way by just applying surface compost and forking, and that's it. The next location in this side of the garden is going to be this raised bed. All of these raised beds were filled with the same soil. This one's just going to be easy to access. I've always been curious to see whether raised bed soil that I purchased does actually have everything it needs for these plants. So today we're going to actually find out. And now we're back here where I've already collected a sample. And again, remember, we're looking to see if the organic matter content has increased from last year because this bed was the lowest of the bunch. And the last location is going to be right over here, but I think you have to come take a look at this first. I wanted to bring you in close because I needed you to appreciate the size of these cabbages. Look at that right there. That's another level. That's going to be taking up a lot of nutrients. So I'm very curious to see how depleted this bed has become from growing these giant cabbages because I am planning on putting tomatoes in here. So in this case, I really want to know if I need to do a lot of amending or if I'm good to just go ahead and do a quick little flip. Over here in the south garden, we're going to be just testing two basic areas. I want to test this section. So I'll be collecting from that bed, maybe one scoop out of here. And then back here, I've had some issues with this bed, so I'm trying to diagnose what's going wrong. So we're definitely going to be focusing one test on just this one 4x8 bed. And that's it for this side of the garden. Here are all the sites laid out. Don't worry, I do have a little label right on each tray. So what you're going to see moving across, first of all, this is the raised bed mix. So you'll see a lot of perlite, there's pumice in there. And what's interesting is that when I dug down, I found a fully myceliated layer of soil here. So this is all white because it's full of mushroom spawn. I am going to sieve through that and include it in the test just out of curiosity. Now working through here, these are all actual native soil mixed with compost I've been amending to soil over time. And you'll see a little bit of color variation. Most of that is probably just due to the different level of moisture. So this is pretty dry. That's why it looks a little bit lighter in color. This one's a little bit wetter, and that's probably why it's a little bit darker. The other reason soil could be dark is because it has a lot of compost or organic matter in it. So the ultimate test, though, is going to be the results of these soil tests. So the next thing I'm going to do, just to keep it consistent, is go ahead and sift each one of these, bag them up, and then I'll show you how to enter your samples online. Before we ship these soil samples, I need to make sure I register each one of these tests. So you have a website, and then you have an actual number here, your sample ID, which is also printed on the box on the bottom left corner. So I'm gonna go ahead and enter that first bed that we collected, the pepper bed, and I'm entering the sample ID, my email address, and I hit next. It asks you to describe the part of your garden that you're testing. In this case, it's a garden type, vegetable, fruit, flower. I'm gonna go ahead and call it a vegetable garden, because that's the most likely thing that I grow. And then I'm gonna put vine type, because vine type is gonna cover a broader range of plants than just a leafy green. And then down here, approximate area in square feet. So this is a single bed test, so a pretty small area. Let's go ahead and call it a 3x10, so 30 square feet, 3 times 10. And then preference for recommended product. I'm an organic grower, so I'm gonna select organic. The reason why it asks you this is because once you get your results, it's going to give you some recommendations. For example, if one of your nutrient levels is too low, it'll recommend a product and how much of it you need to apply to bring your numbers up to the ideal. So that's it. I just need to register every single one of these. Once they get shipped out, you should get results back pretty quick. So I'll see you guys in a few days when I get my results. It has been 1 week since I sent off the soil to get tested at the lab, and I finally have my results. One thing I forgot to mention when I sent those tests off is that you want to make sure that you write down the name of the area that you're testing, especially if you're doing multiple tests. There's no other way to keep track of it. So on this card, you could write, for example, South Beds with the sample ID here. You could keep this card, ship the box. They don't need this, so this could be part of your record keeping. So that's only really relevant if you do more than one. If you do one, then you know exactly what you tested. So let's dive into this testing. Now, the one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a compare and contrast from last year, because I tested the exact same spots using the exact same test last year to this year. So we'll be able to see if my problem-solving solutions to the problems I found last year have actually worked. And spoiler alert, they did, but they also caused new problems. The other thing I'm going to do first here is break down just one of these soil tests. So a single test so that you could actually understand what the format looks like, what the information means, and what you could do about it. So this is an example of one of the tests. This is specifically the South Garden, which is gesturing over there. And over here is my North Garden. So what I did over there is probably what most typical gardeners will do, which is, let's say you have a single garden area, you don't have infinite funds because most of us don't, and you wanted to get a general picture for your soil health and nutrition that's in there. Well, in that case, I tested 3 or 4 different beds, blended all that soil together and sent that off as a single test. So yes, I don't know the exact sort of nutritional profile of my soil in each and every single one of those beds, but I have a generalized picture, and I don't expect it to be that different from bed to bed. And in fact, across all of these tests, across my entire garden, it's really not that different. The numbers are different, but the ranges are all within the same area. So let's look at these results. First thing you're going to see is a bunch of bar charts. This is just a rough, quick view of how your soil is doing, whether it's high, low, or optimal. So high just means that you tested over the recommended range. Low is that you're below it. So first 3 major things that's being tested is soil pH, organic matter, and capacity to retain nutrients. Now, pH is important just because if you're at the wrong pH, your plants simply won't do well. Now, especially something like an extreme case like blueberries, if you don't have very acidic soil, they're just not going to produce blueberries for you, and they probably won't even taste good. But if you're anywhere basically between 6 and maybe up to 8, I probably wouldn't go that high. But if you're in that 7 plus or minus 5 range, then you're probably good. You don't really have to worry about it too much. In this case, I am right above that optimal range at 7.1. Ideally, it would be like 6.2 to 6.8 pH, but that's not a big enough deviation for me to actually worry about it. So pH across the board for all my tests, nothing really major, nothing to worry about. Now, the next thing is, for me, the most important result by far, which is the organic matter or OM percentage. That is the presence of organic matter in your soil. So organic matter is the stuff that you might find in compost. It's things like plant roots, plant leaves, twigs, anything that is a naturally derived sort of plant part, or even I think like cow manure will count towards the organic matter percentage. It's anything that's decaying that's organic. So not like sand, clay, silt, but organic matter. So you want it to be 5 to 7%. Ideally, you would not want that number to really go up above 12, 14%. You're going to start having other issues, but honestly, the chances of anyone getting that are very low. So in this case, I'm very perturbed because my number is 4.17. I really, really want it to be closer to 7%. This is quite low. I'm definitely bummed to see that. So that is my biggest thing that I'm going to be working on in all these tests, is figuring out how to make that number go up higher. Because organic matter is what's being broken down in your soil by soil microorganisms or organisms, and they convert that stuff into nutrients for your plants so that your plants could actually grow. That is why it's so important, especially for an organic grower, or if you're a low-till or no-till grower. This is a number you want to track every single year, and it's going to give you your best idea of overall fertility and soil health. So in this case, to me, this is a red flag. I needed definitely to do some work here. So next number, capacity to retain nutrients, CEC, which is also cation exchange capacity. That might sound like a big, scary name, but basically all it means is, can your soil hold on to a lot of nutrients, and can it hold on to it for a decent period of time? So the higher the number, the more nutrients it could hold, the lower the number, the less. What it really breaks down to is how sandy is your soil. Sandy soil is going to have a low cation exchange capacity because it's mostly made out of quartz, and quartz doesn't have anywhere where those positive cations, things like calcium, can actually bind onto it and stay. Instead, it just washes right through your grain of quartz, just like your water does. So if you have clay soil, on the other hand, well, that has the ability to hold onto cations, it has the ability to retain nutrients, it has the ability to retain water, so it's just going to naturally have a higher number. Things like organic matter can also increase that number, but it's really coming down to whether you have sandy or clay-rich soil, and here's how you use this number. If your number is high like mine is, well, that means that you can apply fertilizer in a much less frequent period, say months instead of like every couple weeks like some people recommend, because that clay is going to hold on to those nutrients. The plants can then access it when they need it. Whereas if you have a quartz or sandy soil, well, that number is going to be low, and instead you're probably going to want to apply fertilizer on a more frequent basis at lower numbers. That way you make sure that you're not just literally draining your fertilizer into the earth, but your plants are actually making use of it. That is the big three. Those three numbers probably have the biggest impact on how your garden is doing and also how you're actually going to react to it. Once you get past that, you get into the nutrients. So in this case, they are not testing for nitrogen because nitrogen is a volatile compound. There's multiple parts of nitrogen that realistically need to be tested, and most soil tests can only tell you like 1 or 2 of those. So it's not being tested here. It's a general macronutrient that you know your plants need, and we'll just leave it at that. The other thing it does test for, though, is phosphorus and potassium. Now, for me, phosphorus and potassium have always been high. A lot of this, I believe, has to do with compost, which we'll get into during the comparison, and also the fact that I have soils that are derived from weathered granite. Weathered granite's just going to naturally have more potassium present than other soils, just due to the mineral composition of what the soil is made out of. So both of those are high. Honestly, that's not great. They shouldn't really be crazy high. They should be closer to the optimal range, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing that I'm seeing across the board on all my soil tests is that my calcium is a bit low. Now, calcium can cause issues if it's too low. Actually, any one of these nutrients can cause an issue if it's too low or too high. So here's how I would use this test. I'll do calcium as an example, but this is true for every single one of the rest of these numbers. Is let's say you have a low calcium like this. Well, what you could do is Google plant low calcium plant stress, or like what does low calcium look like in plants for example. And for me, that ended up turning up a bunch of results about unhealthy leaf growth where they have brown rims, things like that. It's actually something I've seen in my garden. So in this case, I'm looking at this low calcium number and I'm thinking, this is something I should actually action on. Now, the way I'm going to do that, I haven't quite decided. One of them is probably going to be water-soluble calcium that I run through my drip lines directly to my plants. So again, if any one of these numbers are too high or too low, just go ahead and search what does low calcium do to my plants, and you'll probably find a bunch of results. So the rest of these are all within the normal range here: magnesium, sulfur, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, and boron. Now, one other note on boron is specifically if you've tried growing beets before and the beets just never worked, they just literally never formed beets, well, it's possible that you have a low or too low of a boron number because beets require a small amount of boron to even produce a root in the first place. That is how these kind of results can really become impactful to you, is if you have an extremely low deficiency in something, well, that gives you a solution to solve that might solve a lot of problems that you might be having in your garden. For me, calcium and organic matter are going to be major things that I'm looking at this year. So that's an example of one of these tests. If you scroll down, since when you register this test, you enter the general size of your garden. So for example, let's say you put in, it's a 10 by 10 garden, 10 by 10 foot garden, it's 100 square feet. Well, this will tell you exactly how many pounds of different fertilizers to apply based on the size garden you gave it. So in this case, I don't remember what the size is that I put for this garden, but it tells me that I should be putting 1 pound of nitrogen annually in the springtime to satisfy the nitrogen needs of that garden. Now, for example, it knows that I'm a little bit low on, that my pH is a little bit high. So it's also recommending me a specific amount of granular sulfur to add to my soil to lower that number closer to what would be ideal. So the same thing, since I don't have a phosphorus deficiency, it doesn't give me a phosphorus recommendation. But if you did, it would tell you exactly how much phosphorus of an organic type, if you chose organic, or a conventional type, if you chose conventional, fertilizer you would need to remedy that issue. So that's one overview of a test really quick. The next one I want to talk about is actually the raised bed soil. I took a scoop of random raised bed soil from my garden over here, just because I was curious, like, how different is this raised bed soil from my actual native in-ground soil? And kind of interesting, the pH flat 7, organic matter very high, 7.18%. That's quite ideal. I'm very pleased to see that. CEC high again, because it probably has so much organic matter. And all the numbers beyond that are either on the high end or within the normal range. Calcium still seems to be an issue even in my raised bed soil. So that's good to know, because that means I could treat my whole garden when it comes to calcium the exact same way. Now, here's where it gets interesting. One thing that I noticed this year is that across my whole garden, I have a ton of grubs in my raised beds, but not in my in-ground soil. Well, what do I have in my raised beds? I have a ton of organic matter. If you've ever digged through your compost pile, you've surely seen grubs in it. Grubs will eat organic matter, produce poop, and that's actually a great thing in small numbers. But if you have so much organic matter, well, all the grubs are going to go to that area where the organic matter is, because that is their primary food source. So raised beds, full of grubs. In ground, not so much. In ground, my soil organic matter is super low. My raised bed soil, very high organic matter, and it's loaded with grubs. So that gives me a direct sort of aha moment as to why those grubs are in my bed. Now, dealing with them is a separate issue. It could be like a nematode application. It could be just being patient and waiting. But this is at least giving me that answer as to why the heck there are so many grubs in my raised bed as compared to my soil. So that is the only really novel thing to learn here. The other thing I did do is I tested a problem part of my garden over there. And honestly, the organic matter is the lowest, so it's way too low. I definitely need to add some more organic matter there. We'll talk about that in a second. Everything else is the same. So I think the main issue with that bed is that I have too many tree roots invading from the driveway side. I have this entire big wall of shrubs there, and all those roots are crawling into my bed, and they're just taking all the water away from my plants, and that's why the plants are suffering and the bed is doing so bad. The organic matter is low, but that is remediable. So I think I'm probably going to add a raised bed there to help protect from those roots a little bit more. But that's really all I could do there. So now we know what the soil test looks like and what all the numbers and words mean. So let's do a one-by-one comparison from last year to this year. And we're going to be looking at my cabbage bed where I have the giant cabbages and what I've previously called my large tomato bed because I love growing tomatoes in it. So on the left, I have the old result. On the right, I have the new one. And right off the bat, if you look at the bar charts, it looks like most things decreased and some of them decreased substantially. So let's take a look at that. So pH dropped a little bit, nothing really actionable there to worry about. Before it was actually a little bit too high, now it's within the optimal range. And the big thing that really changed here is the organic matter percentage. Now, at the end of the last video, I saw my phosphorus levels and I said, maybe I'm applying too much compost because compost can have a lot of phosphorus. And so I told myself, in order to fix this problem, I will not be applying compost in nearly the same amounts as I did the previous year. And that's exactly what I did. I applied very little compost, and now what I have to show for it is that my organic matter percentage has plummeted. But the other thing that did plummet alongside it is my phosphorus, potassium, which is exactly what I wanted because that's what I said I wanted. And the thing is that while they dropped, they didn't really drop to a optimal level. They dropped substantially, double-digit percentage for sure. Phosphorus went from 500 to 350. Potassium went from 1,400 to 455. So those are really substantial drops. And initially I was like, this probably is related to the compost, but then I also saw that my sulfur dropped by nearly half. And after doing a little bit of research, I did confirm that sulfur can be high in animal manure-based compost, which is exactly what I was using. So we know for sure that my organic matter dropped, my phosphorus, my potassium, and my sulfur dropped, and all of those things are high in manure-based compost, which is a thing that I stopped using as much. So was that a good decision on my part? Well, yes and no. Basically, the yes is that I now know for sure where those numbers are coming from. I now know that I can control them by limiting that input of organic manure-based compost. So what am I going to do about it basically? Well, the thing I'm going to do about it is if I order more compost this year, it'll be compost that is green-based, meaning that it's just plants instead of manure. And I also will be doing chop and drops more regularly to increase my soil organic matter. I'm also going to be growing more cover crops where I could leave tons of big roots in the ground. I could chop and drop those as well as a mulch on top. And both of those things should basically drastically increase my soil organic matter percentage. Now let's take a look at the exciting spreadsheet where I've laid out the 4 tests that are the exact same from last year to this year. And what you'll see across the board is that the organic matter dropped pretty substantially in most of the beds, anywhere from 35, 55, 45%. One of them didn't move much. It only drops 2%. I don't know what that means really, but the phosphorus and the potassium across the board did drop in all of those sites, as did the sulfur by basically half across the board. So to me, this is confirmation of exactly what I was just saying. Animal manure-based composts are fantastic if your soil is already well balanced enough and you don't have too many overages in these kind of elements. And that's exactly what I have. So what this means is if I don't use these manure-based composts, that means I'll have to add more organic fertilizers in exchange to get that sort of nutrition that I was hoping to get out of that manure. And that's really all it is to it. It's very simple. Now I know I have exact results with numbers, with time, with experiments of what I did differently from year to year. But the other thing that's different is that I waited till spring this year. Last year I did it in January. And also we had 12 inches of rain in that time period from January to March this year. So some of these nutrients could have just literally washed away or washed down deeper into the soil, things like the phosphorus and potassium perhaps. And I don't really know for sure, but I do know that everything that dropped together is related to compost, and that gives me great sort of satisfaction to know. The thing that I'm embarrassed by is how low my organic matter percentages are. We're definitely going to be trying to bring them all above 5% for sure, and hopefully even higher than that into the 7 range again. So now we have some marching orders basically. I gave you the solutions that I'm going to be using to solve these problems, and we'll do another test next year to see if I can bump that organic matter percentage without raising those other numbers up too high. And yeah, that's what I learned this year. It wasn't maybe the most dramatic thing, but for me, I've learned that calcium is something I'm going to be working on big time this year, and organic matter percentage is what I'm also going to be focusing on, but I'm not going to be using manures in order to lift that number up. And for me, that's a fantastic result. It's giving me literal things to pay attention to and also solutions on how to solve these problems. Now, if you do have any questions, and sorry if this was a little bit too long in the back end here, I just got a little bit excited looking at these results, please put them down in the comments because I'd love to answer them. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on soil testing and whether you've done soil testing year after year and found that to be a helpful thing for your garden. Because for me, this is definitely going to be a yearly tradition. I can't wait. Actually, I'm very excited to see if I can fix this issue by the time next year where I could get this test done again. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.